Welcome. I'm Cori Ellison, and thank you for your interest in my reflections on Schumann's Frauenliebe und Leben. Schumann was the quintessential 19th century romantic. He loved the romantic poets of his own generation and the dream worlds that they conjured. And his response to poetry was subjective more than intellectual. In his choice of poetry to set to music, Schumann most often showed impeccable taste. We see here that he made 42 settings of Heine, 27 of Rückert, 19 of Goethe, 16 of Eichendorff. Then next on the list, we see a few less distinguished poets, 14 settings of Kerner, 11 of Chamisso. Schumann's father was a bookseller as well as a novelist and a translator of English literature, including that of Walter Scott and Lord Byron. At age 7, Schumann began piano lessons, and in his teen years, his love of literature blossomed to the point where he himself wrote novels. Here we see the young Schumann, the earliest portrait of him, and the house where he was born and lived in Zwickau in eastern Germany. In 1827, the young Schumann enrolled as a law student at the University of Leipzig, fulfilling a stipulation in his late father's will. The following year in Leipzig, Schumann attended a house concert where he heard a recital by a 9-year-old piano prodigy, Clara Wieck. He so admired Clara's playing that he stopped studying law, which he'd never really been interested in much, to study with Clara's father, the famous piano teacher, Friedrich Wieck. And here you see the very forbidding-looking Wieck and his talented daughter, Clara. While taking lessons, Schumann rented a room in the Wieck household for about a year, but an injury to his left hand redirected him towards composing. And unlucky for Schumann, lucky for us. So in the 1830s were turbulent for Schumann. By the time Clara Wieck was 16, she and Schumann had fallen in love. And in 1838, they got secretly engaged. Secretly, because Wieck was vehemently opposed to his virtuoso daughter marrying an impoverished composer. Wieck sent Clara away, and he forbade the two to communicate. In 1839, Robert and Clara decided to sue Wieck, and after a long, drawn-out court case, the judge allowed the two to marry. And their wedding took place in this church in Leipzig, Schönefeld, the day before Clara's 21st birthday. Schumann had already reached his zenith as a composer for piano by then, but he had so far ignored the song form. Then, early in 1840, while Clara was in Berlin concertizing, he wrote to her, "Oh, Clara, what bliss to write songs. I should sing myself to death like a nightingale." Anticipating his long-delayed marriage, Schumann's pent-up emotion took the form of a protean flood of vocal music, and he wrote nothing else all year long, so that 1840 would come to be known as Schumann's Liederjahr, or Year of Song. And here is that monumental list of what he wrote in that one year, 1840. In the 12 months that followed February 1st of that year, he wrote at least 135 songs, nearly half of his total song output. This is probably still a world record of song composition within a one-year period. Most of these songs were composed during the fraught months before August, when the court case was settled and decided in the young couple's favor. Early in 1840, Schumann created a wedding gift for Clara, Myrten, or Myrtles, Opus 25, a set of 27 songs on love poems by a variety of poets. Then, between the late spring and August of that year, he composed the great song cycle Dichterliebe, Poet's Love, on poems by Heine. And after that, two separate song cycles, both called Liederkreis, Opus 24 on poems of Heine, and Opus 39 on poems of Eichendorff. And of course, also in that year, Frauenliebe und Leben. And every measure of every one of these 1840 songs glows with romantic ardor. Though they're strikingly diverse, Schumann's songs of 1840 tend to exhibit some typical traits. And here we can see what they are. First is thematic recall, the use of themes, motives, and then closely linked tonal succession. It's pretty much impossible or very difficult to excerpt any one of these songs from the cycles it comes from. Also, there's the equality of voice and piano. Schumann believed that poet and composer were equal, and also that the voice and the piano were equal. Of course, Schumann, let's remember, was a pianist first. He wrote in Observations on Composers and Composing, he wrote, parallel to the development of poetry, the Franz Schubert epoch has been followed by a new one, which has utilized the improvements of the accompanying instrument, the piano. The voice alone cannot reproduce everything or produce every effect. So also we see number 4 here, piano preludes and postludes, which are typical of Schumann's songs, but especially the 1840 songs. And then finally, the other typical trait that we see is the turn. You see there on the left, the symbol of the turn and how it sounds underneath, how that symbol plays out. And we'll hear some of that when we listen to a couple of excerpts from the cycle. So now we come to the proverbial elephant in the room, Frauenliebe und Leben, Opus 42, the cycle itself and its problematic text. Let's face it, it resoundingly fails the Bechdel test. And here we see that this is the origin of the Bechdel test. What we see here is a 1985 comic strip by the American cartoonist Alison Bechdel. And in it, you see two women are contemplating seeing a film. And one of them explains that she goes to a movie only if it meets the following criteria. 1, it has to have at least 2 women in it. 2, the women have to talk to each other. And 3, they have to talk about something other than a man. So clearly, Frauenliebe und Leben does not cut this particular mustard. As the British soprano Carolyn Sampson wrote in a recent article in The Guardian, she wrote, its texts sum up a woman's life roughly as 1, I can't think of anything but him. 2, he's wonderful and I'm not worthy. 3, oh my God, he said he loved me. 4, I am his and I have the ring to prove it. 4, girlfriends, today I leave you for him. 6, I am pregnant with mini you. 7, I feed my baby and I am fulfilled. 8, your death is the first time you have truly hurt me. Sampson continues, these songs were composed in 1840 to poems written in 1830. The accepted and expected view of a woman's life was pretty much as described here. The words are of their time. But singers are used to inhabiting characters on stage that have nothing to do with our own personalities. A singer's job is to use their imagination and empathy to understand motivations and make each character believable. So let's have a look at the man who perpetrated this poetry. This is Adalbert von Chamisso. He was a German poet and botanist of French descent. His verses are straightforward and old-fashioned, with not an iota of the metaphysical depth of Eichendorff or the neurosis and ironic tang of Heine. These poems are those of a 19th century male instructing wives how they should regard their husbands as beings superior to the niedere Magd, the lowly maiden. They're meant to reflect the feelings of his 18-year-old wife towards the 40-year-old Chamisso. Some commentators, though, have suggested that for Schumann, the poem's balance of power is shifted, that the adoring, self-abnegating spouse who voices these sentiments actually symbolizes Schumann himself, losing himself in and being reborn in the love of Clara. And who wouldn't love Clara? She was a brilliant, strong, and self-sufficient woman who would turn out to be the family breadwinner, as well as one of the world's greatest pianists, a composer herself, a teacher at the Frankfurt Conservatory, and the editor of her husband's works, all while birthing and raising 8 children and nursing her husband through bouts of debilitating and worsening mental and physical illness. Certainly, Schumann's life and work truly was dedicated to Clara. And Frauenliebe und Leben is among the most deeply felt declarations of love in all of music. Though these poems are hardly first rank, their deep expressivity inspired several German composers to set them to music even before Schumann did, including the great balladeer Karl Löwe in 1836 and Franz Lachner in 1839. It's interesting that 4/5 of all of Schumann's songs belong to cycles, and most of these cycles are musically integrated by key sequence and/or by musical themes, the same as in his sets of piano music. And here we see the key relationships in the 8 songs of Frauenliebe und Leben. We see that they're in closely linked tonal succession. And it's also interesting to note that the 6th and the 7th, the 2 penultimate songs in G major and D major, are in the brightest keys. And those are the 2 songs that, that have to do with children. From the very beginning of the cycle, we see Schumann's literary sensitivity playing out in how his melodies grow from the poem's natural rhythms. Here's a bit from the first song, sung here by Elizabeth Schumann and pianist Gerald Moore in 1949.
Ich ihn gesehen, glaub ich blind zu sein, wo ich ihn nur blicke, seh ich ihn allein, wie im wachen Traume schwebt sein Bild.
So we heard this slow strophic saraband that began with plain piano chords depicting a kind of hushed awe and a strange tinge of sadness as the protagonist describes herself as blind to all but her beloved. And she claims she'd rather stay in her room weeping than frolic with her sisters. And this loving melody is underpinned by altered or minor chords and capped with uneasy harmonies at the end of each verse that suggest a kind of uncertainty or apprehension. She can't quite believe this is happening to her. So the second song, let's hear a bit of this. This is a wonderful recording by the great German mezzo Brigitte Fassbender with Erwin Gage at the piano from 1985. And we're going to hear a lot of those turns, those musical figures that we saw in the previous slide that are a recurring feature of Schumann's 1840 songs. So here we are.
Bist du vorne, wie so mild, wie so gut, holde Lippe, klares Auge, heller Sinn und fester Mut. So wie dort die blaue Tiefe, hell und herrlich in der Stern, an so hin, an meinem Himmel, hell und herrlich hin und fern.
So there we heard this one bar prelude that started with these 8 light reiterated 8th note chords, kind of like a quick elated heartbeat. And over this, the voice and or the piano alternate in a joyful melody over a strong bass line in octaves. Maybe that represents the voice of the beloved man. The middle of the song after this brings a new mood of hushed reflection and starts a journey through a bunch of different keys. And on and around the word Demut or humility, there's a devotional sounding repeated bunch of chords reminiscent of the song Widmung, the famous first song of Schumann's cycle Myrten. So we come now to the third song, and this is going to be a recording by the great Lotte Lehmann with the Frieder Weissmann Trio from 1928.
Ich kann's nicht fassen, ich glaube, es hat ein Traum mich berührt. Wie hätte doch unser mich arm erhöht und berührt. Mir was habe gesprochen, ich bin auf Ewigkeit. Mir was, ich träume noch immer, es kann ja nimmer sein, es kann ja nimmer sein.
So we see that this is unusual for Schumann because there's no piano prelude. The voice jumps right in. And again, as in the first song, there's more joy in the words than there seems to be in the music, which is in C minor. You've got these short stabbing piano chords and unsteady harmonies, which kind of stress, again, the singer's disbelief that this exalted man has chosen her. In song number 4, we hear the late, great Jesse Norman and pianist Erwin Gage in 1977. So we see that this song is the epitome of quiet, private rapture. The singer contemplates the ring, the engagement ring, that's the symbol of her union with her beloved. And this song draws on themes from the cycle's second song, but it transforms them from outgoing to rapt and reverent. And the piano provides a gentle flowing accompaniment. The fifth song depicts the bustle of the wedding day. And here we're going to hear it sung by the great German soprano Elisabeth Grümmer with Aribert Reimann, composer and pianist at the piano in 1966.
Helft mir, Schwestern, freundlich mich schmücke, den ja glücklichen heute mir, findet geschäftig mir um die Schwere, nach der blühenden Myrte ziel, als ich befriedigt freudigen Herzens, sonst den Geliebten im Arme lag, immer noch rief seht auf die Kerze, und wie heilig den heutigen Tag. Helft mir, ihr Schwestern, helft mir verscheuchen eine törichte Bangigkeit, dass ich mit klarem Auge ihn empfang in die Quelle der Freudigkeit. Bist mein Geliebter, du mir erschienen, gibst du mir Sonne deinen Schein. Lass mich in Andacht, lass mich in Demut, lass mich verneigen im Herren ein.
So we see that in the piano prelude with those rising and falling arpeggi, also recall Widmung, the song from Myrten. And it suggests a kind of elated impatience for the imminent wedding. In the third stanza, we hear a sudden change to these sort of devout eighth note chords when the singer expresses her humility before her beloved. And throughout this cycle, we hear this pattern of devout, almost churchy sounding music whenever she sings about humbly serving her man. The final stanza returns to the jubilant music of the song's opening until the singer bids a sad farewell to her sisters in a short, sudden turn to G-flat major. But the piano postlude is a wedding march built from the song's main theme. And we come to song number 6, here sung for us by the great Dutch soprano Ellie Ameling and the late great Dalton Baldwin at the piano from 1974. So this song exudes a calm, tender sweetness as the blissful woman prepares to tell her husband that she's pregnant. After 2 identical verses, a short piano interlude morphs us into a bright C major for the third stanza and a less melodic, more recitative style passage over static harmonies. And over this slight but increasingly intense chordal accompaniment, the woman tells her husband to come closer. She has important news to whisper to him. It's taken her 23 bars to tell him that she's expecting, but actually it's the piano that tells him. After she sings, "Now You Understand My Tears," the piano's left hand reprises the opening melody. For the penultimate song of the cycle, we have a recording by the contemporary singer, the British mezzo Sarah Connolly, with Eugene Asty at the piano. This is the latest recording that I'm playing for you today, recorded in 2008.
Das Glück, ich hab's gesagt und nehm's nicht zurück, hab überschwänglich mich geschätzt, bin überglücklich, aber jetzt, nur die da säugt, nur die da liebt das Kind, dem sie die Nahrung gibt.
So this is perhaps the cycle's simplest song, and some critics have suggested that it lacks complexity because the male poet and composer couldn't possibly have understood motherhood. But Schumann certainly does depict the joy of it in his simple, merry round dance. There's a piano postlude in this song that shows maybe a higher level of expressiveness with a tender but cheerful rocking that suggests a mother holding and calming her baby. We come to the final song of the cycle, and an absolutely shattering performance by the late, great American mezzo-soprano Lorraine Hunt Lieberson with Julius Drake at the piano from 2008. And I'm going to play the whole thing because you just can't not. It's such a great performance. This last stark, unsentimental song begins with a poignant D major triad, and rising minor thirds seem to express resentment as well as courage. There's this tragic, low-pitched recitative in which the singer accuses her husband of hurting her for the first time by dying. The pitch rises to the word leer, empty, as a sforzando piano chord emphasizes the chill with empty, tragic chromaticism. Schumann repeats the melody of the cycle's blissful opening song as a long epilogue for solo piano, an idea that he may have lifted from Beethoven's song cycle An die ferne Geliebte. The piano melody recalls the relationship's sweet beginnings, but this time voiceless and disembodied, like the riderless horse often seen at funerals. Interestingly, our heroine ends by looking back to memory instead of looking forward. Schumann chose not to set Chamisso's 9th poem, Traum der eigenen Tage, in which the heroine finds consolation as a grandmother passing on wisdom to her granddaughter. Commentators have suggested that this shows that Schumann chose to reinforce the idea that a woman's life begins and ends with her husband. I have a hard time believing that because, well, Clara, thank you.